Hello everyone. Let's continue with chapter 2 of your book. We're going to be talking about measuring populations and give an example using the census and race when it comes to dealing with data. I want to remind you that how we classify data is quite important. Here are two maps, and you can see that they look quite different, but both of these maps are based off of the same data. It's just that they're classified differently. And this is one example we talked about last week on the cautionary tale about how to present data and how to interpret data. One of the things to keep in mind for this chapter on data is that there are many ways it can be misleading. Let's start with just some basic population information. Here's the population density of the United States. It's not much different in 2020. It has changed slightly in some ways. The trend has continued to be movement towards the south. One difference that we do see is that California has stopped growing and in fact now is losing people, which is something we can talk about later. But again, the way this is measured is you have a map of the United States, but the geographic unit of measurement is counties, showing people per square mile. When you examine a map like this, you always want to see how it's classified and what the geographic units are. Here's an average annual population growth for the United States between 1930 and 2000, and you can see clearly that the growth has been in the southeast and the southwest, and the losses primarily have been in the central areas of the United States, the Midwest and the Great Plains region. Here's an interesting map that is showing the center of the country. So if you were to measure geographically the center of the population, you can see how it has shifted west and southerly over the last couple of centuries. So this is the kind of thing that we're interested in measuring, but it goes a lot further than this. What we need to be able to really measure, count up, or enumerate the population are several different methods and tools. We're going to be concerned with the type of data that we're using, the scale of the data as I just showed, the quality of the data. We'll be looking at vital statistics, the census, and the American Community Survey. The demographic elements that we need to focus on as geographers, as analysts, are the size, how many of a population, what characterizes the population, in other words, the composition, how diverse is it, and in what ways, and where is it distributed, the places of residence, and so on. Some of the primary themes we'll be discussing are mortality, natality or births, and migration. So let's start with the measures of data quality. One thing we need to think about is when we're dealing with a population, typically the data that we have is a set of the population, a representative sample. It's important to note or to understand just how accurate this representation is of the population. One of the differences between the census and the American Community Survey is that the census tries to measure everyone, whereas the American Community Survey, the ACS, is a sample. That's an important distinction we'll get into in a bit. How timely is the data? What time period does it cover? What events are included? That may or may not matter greatly depending on the type of research that you're doing. What is the data covering? The geographic areas of spatial scale. Does it conform to your research needs? And also, as a researcher, one of the things we run into quite a bit, and it can be a bit frustrating at times, is what is available. And sometimes you have data and it's not accessible. Sometimes you just don't have it. Researchers then are tasked with coming up with their own individualized data sets. There are many problems with data. There are often undercounts. There are often errors and misinformation embedded in the data. And then there are other issues that have to do with confidentiality and privacy and security. Okay then, let's take a look at some details about population and data. When you're dealing with a research region or study focus, you need to be specific and consistent across your data set. It has to be defined carefully. It has to include appropriate samples and delineate or differentiate different cohorts or different population groups. There are two types of data, generally speaking. There is primary data that's collected by researchers, and then there's secondary data that's organizationally based. There are differences between quality and quantity. That is, qualitative data is about understanding the subtleties and the nuances of human behavior. It's very difficult to isolate variables in that regard because we're dealing with social dynamics, human dynamics, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and issues such as, let's say, race and gender and class. And so there are a lot of subjective aspects to it. In many ways, the information has to be negotiated, that it has to be culturally mediated to make sense of. This is all often a contested and political problem. For example, what is important about equality? What is important about diversity? You're going to get very differences of opinions. And so how do we understand that data? Well, we need to take an approach that helps us define or give reasons and give legitimacy to our point of view. So in that case, we might have to look towards history, towards academics in political science or in other fields that have spent their lives and their vocation in trying to make sense and argue certain points of view. Some of the methods that we would use in that regard would be things like interviews and participant observation, where we're embedding ourselves within the research. That is, there is no separation, there is no objective distance necessarily between the two. When I was a grad student, I did participant observation in a Latin American community center for a number of years. And I became very involved in the center as I did my research. And that's appropriate as long as that's all transparent and that we conform to legitimate qualitative methods. On the other hand, quantitative data is all about numbers. It's to discover very objective facts about social phenomena. It assumes that there is a fixed and measurable reality that just has to be discovered. The methods there are about taking many different kinds of measurements and doing numerical analysis like comparisons and statistics. In qualitative methods, themes are gathered by informants, whereas in a quantitative method, themes are derived from the actual data results. Let's take a look at some numbers here. Vital statistics are specifically associated with births, deaths, fetal deaths, marriages, and divorce. And they're usually recorded and enumerated by government institutions. Sometimes churches will do the same. For example, the Catholic Church kept vital statistics in many nations and still does in some. Baptism records and that kind of thing would have a lot of this information. In our society, we have civil registration, for example, when an individual is born, when they go to school, when they get married, when they die. This is all recorded and then made legal in different documents that can be mined for this data later on by researchers. Other secondary sources can include different institutions that work directly with data acquisition. For example, here are some that come up quite often. The Health and Education Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Internal Revenue Service, Homeland Security. The United Nations has many different data acquisition agencies, like the World Health Organization, which was really highlighted during the pandemic. There's the Population Reference Bureau. There are regional governments that collect data, like the state of Massachusetts, like the city of Pittsburgh. And then there are universities, which also spend a lot of time collecting data. The other big thing that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is the advent of big data. For example, you can really acquire a great deal of data, massive amounts of data through apps like Google Maps and all kinds of other technologies that allow us to aggregate the ins and outs of people's behaviors and lives across the board in ways that were unimaginable just a generation ago. Let's take a look at the mother of all data acquisition institutions in the United States, the U.S. Census, which has been tasked in the Constitution since 1790 in measuring the population of the United States. So the term enumeration refers to measuring people, all persons in a given time. In this case, The census is decennial, or every 10 years, and it is made up of a collection of demographic and socioeconomic data. And then this data is then analyzed and published for researchers and the general public. Now, we have to make a decision, and a lot of census takers still do have to make a decision of how to count people. You can count people in terms of their location. In other words, de facto location is where people are. It's easier and more economic. De jure is you count individuals based on their legal and permanent residence. So if you would take a timestamp or a flash of a population and you just count where people are, they could be at work, they could be at play, they could be at home. So you just count them where they are. Whereas a de jure count means that you just ignore everything but their legal permanent residence. And it's more difficult to do, costs more money, but researchers generally prefer it as more accurate. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both methods. For de facto, the disadvantage is that you miss people in transit, people moving around, which is a large number of people, especially when you have high mobility, like you do in a lot of modern nations. This can create a false area data problem. With de jure method, the disadvantages is, again, it's time consuming, expensive. You can sometimes miss or double count people when you have situations of high mobility as well. For example, how do you count college students? Do you use their home, where they grew up, or do you count them in the dorm? And since college students are highly mobile, this makes a big difference. Same thing with immigrants coming in. How do you count them? Do you count them as they come in and are processed and maybe are living in a temporary facility? Or do you count them as once they have established their own home? And then what do you do with the undocumented? A lot of big problems, a lot of big challenges to deal with. Now, the other thing you can do, since the census is a timestamp every 10 years, you might be interested in some year in between. And so you can create estimates based on what's called an intercensus estimate. So what you do is you take the preceding census as the starting point, let's say 2010, and you're interested in the year 2014. You add the births and immigrants, you subtract the deaths and the immigrants from that particular time. But then again, you're interested in 2014, so you have to adjust the count somehow. Once you have the population size, you can then estimate or calculate morbidity rates, mortality rates, and fertility rates. That is, you know how the population is changing via different cohorts, different age groups, and so on, gender. From that, then you can just do simple math to figure out how many people have been born, died, what the birth rate is, and so on. The purpose of all this is manifold. One is that the census is used for political representation in our democratic system. This is how we draw congressional and state legislative districts. Also locally, this is how school districts are assigned and voting precincts. So it matters politically and in terms of power how the census works and what it discovers. The House of Representatives is based on population, so it changes. Unlike the Senate, which is you just have 2 senators per state, each state gets a certain number of representatives based on the size of the population. And as that population changes, a state can gain or lose representation. How the United States federal government distributes their money to states is according to the census. The census also informs federal, tribal, state, and local governments in a whole score of planning decisions: transportation, education, environment, health, and so on. Also, businesses and nonprofits will use this information very extensively to do things like figure out where to locate their businesses, how big their markets are, how to basically maximize their profits, or how to help people in the most efficient way possible. And also the census is used as a benchmark, as a base for a lot of other surveys that are done in the United States. The 2020 census was very challenging in many ways. There was a lack of money and a lack of political will to give it enough money. There was the challenge of rapidly changing technologies. So you need to have a standardized method of collecting this data, but the technology is diverse and changing all the time. So you have to rationalize that somehow. There's an explosion of information going on with big data and the internet and now AI that we're still struggling to get a handle on. A big issue now is, especially in the last 10, 15 years, the distrust in government has really grown tremendously. Back in the 1950s and 60s, you looked at surveys, the vast majority of Americans generally trusted the government. Today, the vast majorities of Americans have a certain level of distrust, from some distrust to extreme distrust in government. And that makes it very difficult then to do things like a census, because you need the cooperation and the collaboration of the public. This has led to declining response rates and also even deception at times. People just basically lie in the census for political reasons. The other thing that's happened is America is becoming more and more multicultural. And so our population is increasingly becoming more diverse, which makes it more challenging to enumerate. The way we live and socialize has changed. Rather than just being sort of nuclear family based as we were more in the past, our family arrangements have become much more diverse. That's also been a challenge. And our population is quite mobile. That is, people moving around a lot, moving from town to town, city to city, state to state, or even in and out of the country. All of these things have made the 2020 census really challenging. The real big issue that was front and center was what to do with immigrants and immigration, how you measure them. And again, don't forget that this will determine political power. And so there are forces on all sides trying to negotiate this and trying to leverage this to their benefit. So the 2020 census redesigned itself and tried to respond to these challenges. It tried to identify people where they lived by conducting reviews and updates. It created communication partnerships with all kinds of other institutions to try to collect the data in a rational way. It created ads to target audiences to try to get people to collaborate and work with census takers. Think about one issue, for example, that 10, 15 years ago, most people had landlines. Now most people are on mobile phones, and that's made a huge difference as well in terms of responsiveness to the questions. And then the other issue is how, once the data has been compiled, how to release the census results. One of the things researchers have discovered is they changed the whole process. So we've had to, in many ways, relearn how to access the data, which we'll do in the class later on. The census is organized by geographic hierarchies, at the top obviously being the nations, all the way down to census blocks, you can see from this graphic. A census block is a neighborhood block. And then you group those into census tracts and so on. It really depends on the kind of research that you're doing, which geographic unit you'll be needing to use. If you're looking at a very fine geographic area, you want to go as low as possible in terms of the smallest unit of measurement, which would be the census block. You can't go any further than that because of confidentiality issue. The census does not release individual information until several decades later, when this information is released for historical purposes. Now, the American Community Survey is a sample of the U.S. population, and it's taken yearly across and in between the census. So it measures a small percentage of the population, sends out these questionnaires, and then it extrapolates what the numbers to the general population. And here's an example of one of the questionnaires. Very similar to the census, but not as extensive. Okay, so what I want to do now is switch to looking at measuring human population in the context of all of these challenges: cultural challenges, political challenges, mathematical challenges, and so on. Let's take a look at race and ethnicity in that light. So you can see here's a survey of measuring well-being based on racial and ethnic cohorts: whites, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and so on. How much money they make, and how this compares to the dominant racial group historically, which is Caucasians or whites. And you can see the percentages here being quite different in terms of how well they're doing, their well-being. Look at income, for example. You can see that Latinos are 39% lower than whites, African Americans 42% lower, Asian Americans 9% higher, Native Americans 40% lower. You can do the same thing with unemployment and poverty and home ownership. And you see the pattern stays pretty consistent, that there are larger issues of poverty in other groups than whites, with the exception of Asian Americans. And so as a researcher, you want to look deeper into this and understand why. What are the historical, cultural, and political reasons for why this has happened? Same thing with education. You can look at the disparities of educational achievement by these different groups. And you can see here for yourself that 41% of Latinos have less than a high school diploma, as compared to just under 10% for white people. That is a critical issue. That is an important thing to untangle and discover why this is happening. It might have to do with immigration rates. It might have to do with how recently they have entered the country. It might have to do with discrimination, cultural aspects, cultural dynamics that we could explore. Interestingly enough, race has been defined differently in our society over the course of the last few centuries. And this is reflected in how the U.S. Census has enumerated people based on this racial category. You can see in the last 100 years or so here how the terms have changed, how the categories themselves have altered over time. You think about it, if this is the case, this is certainly a great evidence to show that race is really more of a cultural phenomenon than a biological one. The concept of race has changed over time, and in 1890 you didn't have terms that you have today, and you didn't have even races that you have today. Then what does that say? The vast majority of researchers, I think the consensus across the board is that race is a historical phenomena that developed in the course of colonialism, and we redefine people over and over again based on these hierarchies. Having said that, let's take a look at the census results in 2010. Here's the national population by race in the United States: whites, blacks, or African Americans, and so on. And you can see the rates of change as well in these green arrows, how quickly the population has been growing. If you looked at the 2020 census today, you will see that these rates have rather significantly different today. Also notice that it differentiates between race and national population by Hispanic or Latino origin. So there's a special case for Latino, that for people in that particular population cohort, that is, the census will ask two questions of people: their race and then their ethnicity, whether or not they're Hispanic or not. And this also is a historical development that comes out of our immigration history as well. In North Carolina, you can see the percentages are not quite the same as the rest of the United States. And for each state, you're going to see these kinds of differences. Here's an example of the U.S. Census survey. Maybe some of you have seen it. I think probably some of you have. Here's the part on race, what it looks like. Categories in 2010, which is basically the same now in 2020, are whites, black, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and then other. Now with Hispanics or Latino, this is basically defined as people who come from countries that speak Spanish. Interestingly enough, there's a distinction between Hispanic and Latino. Latino does not include Spain in most situations, although this is still negotiated, let's say. Here's the specific question that is asked in the census. And then you can delve deeper into that by looking at where the Latinos come from, their countries of origin. And you can see that in the United States, a large percentage are either Central American or Mexican. Now notice that the country of Guatemala and the country of El Salvador are Central American countries. Why do they not categorize them differently? Well, that's because the census self-reports. People will report what their ethnicities are, and the census has to go with that, and researchers have to go with that, and then make sense of it later on. What are we seeing now, and what do we have to look for? Well, politically, immigration has become a real contentious issue. The country is polarized quite extensively along these lines, where the Republicans, particularly Trumpism, has a very hard line with immigration, and especially with undocumented immigrants. Democrats tend to be much more open and embracing of immigration. And it's always been a difference, but the difference has become significantly more extreme in the last 10 years or so. The deeper issue behind all that is how people feel about having a multicultural society. And generally speaking, there are those who favor it, and they tend to be on the democratic or progressive side. And there are those who are suspicious or concerned or even oppose it, feel it is a threat to be too multicultural, that they rather see America as more traditionally white, more traditionally Christian, as it was conceived of in the past. Truth is, of course, is America has always been a multicultural society, and extensively so. Maybe not quite as much as today, but America has been a tapestry of cultures since its inception. But the ideology and the mythology behind it is what's driving a lot of these contentious debates. Here's the distribution of the U.S. population by race in 2010. What we see here is that white and non-Hispanic make up about 64% of the population. And you can look at the rest here yourself. This is what is projected to happen over time, where you see that the percentage of whites in the United States will eventually fall below 50%. And in fact, it already has for children. Young children today are incredibly diverse, much more so in the general population, largely what is expected for everybody in 2050. This group right here, Hispanic, is projected to double in the next 30 to 40 years. And Asians are expected to double as well, but they're starting at a much smaller number. So you can see over time, the country is slated to become much more multicultural. The whites will no longer be the dominant population in terms of percentages. They'll fall below 50%. And for some people, this is a problem. And for some people, this is something to celebrate. And a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. And so this is kind of the core of the argument or the fight that's been happening. Do we want this to happen or not? Those who do not want it to happen are really pushing hard to create more and more immigration restrictions to try to stem this change. Although it's going to be incredibly difficult to do so, this is an organic process that's not happening just in the United States, but it's happening in much of the world. Many countries are experiencing the same multicultural flourishing, and it's the part of the modern world. So it will be exceedingly difficult to stop this process, and it will require some pretty draconian measures, which I don't think most people would be comfortable with.
Let's take a look at what's happened in 2020. This is according to the latest census. As you can see, the number of white persons in the country has declined from about 64% to about 59%, and Hispanics has increased. The rest, Asians have as well. Blacks have stayed about the same. You can see here that there's a big difference in generation. You look at Gen Z, make up about 44%, are people in the white category. When you get all the way up to age 75, you're looking at 79%, which is more representative of the way the country was in the past. So this is something that is being noticed, and in some communities are alarmed by it. Even in the countryside, even in the rural areas, what we're seeing is that there is a change towards multiculturalism. Particularly, you can look at the upper Midwest, the upper Great Plains, and parts of the northern South, and other areas that have experienced fairly significant demographic change in terms of ethnicity.
Countries all over the world collect data about race and ethnicity. Here's the examples of the countries that are official censuses do that. And it's an important topic across the world. The world is really changing now. We are becoming much more integrated, much more global, and this is reflecting our populations. Here's some examples of the questions that are asked in other censuses across the world. In terms of race and ethnicity, again, you can see that if the concepts of race and ethnicity change over time, and they also change geographically over region, it's another example of the evidence of the fact that these things are just in our minds. We collectively create these categories and then move on from them. But at the time, in the moment, we think they're solid and real. And a lot of people think they're biologically based, which they really, evidence-wise, are not. Here are some more census questions around race and ethnicity, different countries. Now, why do nations collect data on race and ethnicity? Largely to monitor compliance with civil rights laws, because one of the other things that's happened along with our multiculturalism is legal protections and the idea of social justice. That is, that we are trying to create conditions where people flourish, no matter what their ethnic or racial cohort might be. And again, to determine voting districts and congressional districts in many other countries as well, that's the case. It also links to the economy in terms of fairness of employment practices. You can see from the data on poverty that I showed you earlier, one of the ways to tackle that challenge of trying to create equity is to make sure that we have the appropriate legal laws to ensure that there is no discriminatory practices in the business world. And also very much interested in healthcare and education and so on, these kinds of human endeavors that really make a big difference to human health and flourishing. And we see a lot of racial differences in health and education. And one of the things we want to do as researchers is untangle why that is. And as policymakers, we want to do things that try to create a balance and fairness across our population. And then, of course, to do that, to come up with these solutions, you can use a tax system and public services as tools to be able to do that. Now, again, this is contentious today, because if you're interested in stemming the change towards multiculturalism, a lot of these things you're likely to be hostile to a lot of these policies and there's much more I could say on the subject in this lecture alone. And I have included many, many more slides that you should look at and review on your own that I won't cover here. It's my experience that making these lectures too long is a real turnoff for a lot of students, and I've been trying to keep them to about half an hour or less. But what I'd like you to do is look over the slides that continue from here. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me if something doesn't make sense. Primarily, I will draw the questions on the exams from what I talk about and what the book says. These extra things are really for you if you're interested and you want to learn more. Again, please ask if you have questions, and we'll see you next time.